For decades, Melissa Gilbert kept her mouth shut. She smiled through the interviews, waved at the fans, and let everyone believe whatever they wanted to believe about her and Dean Butler. But silence has a way of running out. And after all these years, Melissa finally said what she had been holding back for a very long time. What came out of her mouth was not what anyone expected. Not the fans who grew up watching her every single week. Not the people who sent love letters addressed to Laura and Almanzo. And definitely not the ones who had spent years convinced that what happened on screen was just a hint of something far deeper going on behind the scenes. So why did she stay quiet for so long? And now that she has finally spoken, what does the truth actually look like? Stay right here. Because by the time this story is done, the way you remember that iconic prairie romance is never going to be quite the same again. There is something almost magical about a television show that makes you feel like you are watching real life. And that is exactly what Little House on the Prairie did to millions of people every single week for nearly a decade. It was not just a show about log cabins and dirt roads and kerosene lamps. It was about a family that loved each other fiercely, worked hard without complaint, and found beauty in a life that most people today would call impossibly difficult. People did not simply watch that show from a distance. They lived inside it, at least for an hour at a time. And at the very center of all of it was a young girl named Laura Ingalls, played by Melissa Gilbert, who began that journey at just 9 years old and grew up right there on camera in front of the entire country. People watched her go from a little girl chasing her dog through wide-open fields to a young woman trying to figure out who she was and where she belonged. And when the show introduced a tall, calm, quietly charming young man named Almanzo Wilder, played by Dean Butler, something shifted in the hearts of viewers everywhere. Suddenly, the show was not just about family and hard times and the dignity of a simple life. It was about love. And the way Laura looked at Almanzo, and the way he looked right back at her, made people completely forget they were watching two actors reading from a script. That connection felt too real to be manufactured. It felt like something that could not possibly be faked. And because of that, people spent years wondering what was actually happening between Melissa Gilbert and Dean Butler the moment the cameras stopped rolling. The thing about that question is that it never really went away. Even as years turned into decades, fans kept bringing it up. Every interview Melissa gave, someone found a way to steer the conversation back to Dean. Every reunion clip that surfaced online, people watched it hoping to catch a look or a smile that might finally confirm what they had always believed. Because in the minds of millions of viewers, Laura and Almanzo were not just characters in a television series. They were a love story that felt too perfect and too honest to be fiction. And when a love story feels that real, people have a very hard time accepting that it might have been two talented people simply doing their jobs well. The show aired in an era before the internet, before fans could go online and dig through someone's personal life with a few keystrokes. All people had were the episodes themselves and the occasional magazine interview, and that narrow window made the mystery feel even larger than it already was. The less people knew for certain, the more they filled in the blanks with imagination. And what they imagined was almost always a romance. But Melissa Gilbert was not always the confident, clear-eyed woman who could walk into an interview and speak about any of this with a steady voice. Before she ever became Laura Ingalls, before she ever stood across from Dean Butler on a television set, she was just a little girl trying to find her footing in a world that was already moving much faster than she was ready for. She was born on May 8, 1964, in Los Angeles, California. She was adopted as a newborn by actor and comedian Paul Gilbert and his wife Barbara, a dancer and actress herself, which meant the world of show business was not something Melissa had to discover or seek out. It was simply the air she breathed from the very beginning. Cameras and auditions and scripts were just a normal part of life in her household. And by the time she was 7 years old, she was already doing commercials, not because anyone was pushing her, but because she had something that very few child performers ever actually possess. She was completely natural. She did not perform. She simply existed in front of a camera, and people could not look away. By the time she was 9, that natural quality landed her the role of a lifetime. She walked into an audition for Little House on the Prairie and something clicked almost immediately, especially during her screen test with Michael Landon, the show's star and producer, who played Charles Ingalls, Laura's father. What no one could have predicted at the time was that the bond between Melissa and Michael Landon would grow into something that went far beyond the television show. He became a genuine father figure to her, particularly after her adoptive parents divorced and the emotional ground beneath her feet became unstable. He welcomed her into his home, introduced her to his family, and made sure she always had someone steady to turn to. For a young girl growing up inside the enormous pressure of Hollywood, that kind of relationship was not just comforting. It was essential to her survival. Michael had a way of seeing past the performance and finding the real person underneath the character. He knew when Melissa was struggling even when she was smiling for the cameras. And more than once, he pulled her aside between takes just to check in, not as a producer managing his show, but as someone who genuinely cared about the girl behind the role. That kind of protection mattered more than most people ever realized. The set of Little House on the Prairie was a working environment, but it was also Melissa's entire world during those years. It was where she learned her lines, and where she learned about people. It was where she figured out how to carry real emotion in front of a camera, and how to keep herself together when the emotion she was carrying had nothing to do with the script. There were days when the exhaustion sat heavy in her chest and nobody watching from home would have ever guessed it, because the moment the cameras rolled, she delivered. Every single time. The discipline she developed during those years was not something any acting class could have given her. It came from the sheer necessity of showing up and doing the work regardless of what was happening underneath the surface. And Michael Landon understood that cost better than anyone, because he was carrying his own version of it right alongside her. But even with Michael Landon in her corner, Melissa's early years on that show were not as simple as they appeared from the outside. She was a child carrying the emotional weight of a leading role. While kids her age were going home after school to play and rest, she was memorizing pages of dialogue and delivering tearful performances on cue. The expectations never let up. People saw Laura Ingalls on that screen and expected Melissa to be exactly that in real life. Sweet, wholesome, uncomplicated, and easy. But she was none of those things, not because she was difficult, but because she was a real human being with real confusion and real feelings that had nowhere safe to go while the cameras were pointing at her. And then Dean Butler arrived on set. And everything became a great deal more complicated. When Dean stepped onto the set as Almanzo Wilder, Melissa was 15 years old. She had never had a real boyfriend. She had never been kissed outside of a camera lens. She was still in the middle of figuring out who she was as a person, and now the script was asking her to convincingly portray a woman falling in love with a man who was 23 years old. Think about that for a moment. Not as a television viewer who watched those scenes and felt all the warmth and sweetness of a prairie romance slowly blooming. Think about it from the inside, from the perspective of a 15-year-old girl who was not remotely ready for any of it, and had no choice but to show up every morning and make it look completely effortless. In her memoir, Prairie Tale, Melissa did not soften any of this. She said plainly that she had to pretend to fall in love with a grown man while she still felt like a little girl. She described their first on-camera kiss as terrifying. She used the word awkward. She said it felt deeply strange. There were no gradual conversations, no slow easing into the emotional territory of a romantic storyline. There were just lights and a director and millions of viewers waiting on the other side of that television screen, and Melissa had to deliver something that felt completely authentic, even though she was quietly overwhelmed by every second of it. She has also spoken about the physical discomfort of those early scenes, the stiffness in her body when she had to lean close, the way she would rehearse her lines in her head just to stop herself from thinking about how unnatural the whole situation felt. Nobody watching at home could see any of that. All they saw was a girl falling in love. And that gap between what the audience experienced and what Melissa was actually living through is one of the most telling parts of this entire story. And here is the part that shattered the biggest myth of all. Melissa revealed that during those years on the show, her heart was somewhere else entirely. She had a real crush, a real emotional connection that kept her up at night, and it had nothing to do with Dean Butler. It was with Rob Lowe, the young actor she would later go on to date seriously in real life. Dean, in Melissa's own words, was more like a big brother to her than anything else. She described their relationship as one built on mutual respect and consistent professionalism, not sparks or hidden feelings or stolen glances off camera. When she finally said in a CBS interview that there was simply no romantic spark between them, it was not a disappointing revelation for those who had been paying attention. It was actually one of the most remarkable things she could have said, because it meant that every single moment fans fell in love with on that screen was a result of two people being extraordinarily good at their craft. Dean Butler has been equally honest about all of it. In his own interviews and in his book, Prairie Man, he spoke openly about how aware he was of the age difference between them and how seriously he took the responsibility of making Melissa feel safe and respected at all times. He never pushed any boundaries. He never made her uncomfortable. He kept things professional and considerate, and Melissa has always made it clear that she is genuinely grateful for that. She has said that he was a steady constant during one of the most confusing periods of her young life, and that even without any romance, what they had between them was something real and something lasting. A quiet, grounded friendship rooted in shared history and genuine mutual respect. That is not the love story fans spent decades imagining in their heads. But it might actually be something better than any of those imagined versions. Because here is what people tend to miss when they are too busy searching for hidden romance and secret off-screen relationships. Two people can create something genuinely beautiful together without any of that. Melissa and Dean built one of the most beloved romantic storylines in television history using nothing but talent, trust, and the daily willingness to show up and give everything they had. And the fact that it was not real between them away from the cameras does not take away a single moment of what they gave to their audience. If anything, it makes the whole thing more impressive, because they made millions of people believe in something that did not exist between them, and they did it so completely that those people are still talking about it today, nearly half a century later. When Melissa turned 50 in 2014, she and Dean came back together for a television segment, and the warmth between them was impossible to miss. Not the heat of old romance, but something softer and more enduring. The kind of warmth that only comes from two people who went through something significant together and came out the other side still standing, still speaking, still glad to know each other. They smiled with the ease of people who share memories that no one else in the room can fully understand. And watching that moment, you could see that what they had was not nothing. It was simply different from what the world had always assumed it was. There was no careful distance, no awkward politeness that you sometimes see when two people are managing old wounds. Just two friends sitting together, comfortable in the honest truth of what they actually were to each other. What made that reunion segment so striking was not just the ease between them. It was what it represented for the audience watching. Generations of viewers had grown up carrying Laura and Al Manzo in their hearts like something personal, something borrowed from the show, and kept somewhere private ever since. And here were Melissa and Dean, older and quieter and fully themselves, sitting together without pretense. For a lot of fans, seeing them laugh together and speak kindly about shared memories felt like a kind of closure. Not the romantic kind they had always hoped for, but a different kind. The honest kind. The kind that only arrives when two people have been truthful about what something actually was and are still glad it happened. There is a dignity in that kind of reunion that no dramatic love story could ever match, and the people who watched it could feel that even if they could not quite put it into words. After Little House ended, Melissa did not quietly disappear the way so many child stars do. She pushed hard against the Laura Ingalls image that followed her everywhere she went and sought out darker, more demanding roles. She did theater. She did television films. She worked to show the industry that she was more than braids and sunbonnets. But life off-screen was complicated in ways that fame had not prepared her for at all. She went through public relationships and painful divorces. She battled addiction and the particular kind of self-doubt that tends to find people who grew up being watched by everyone and truly known by almost no one. She talked about all of it with complete honesty in Prairie Tale, and that honesty was exactly what made readers fall for her all over again. Not the actress. Not Laura Ingalls. Melissa Gilbert, the real woman, who had made serious mistakes and carried heavy things and kept moving forward anyway. She talked about the plastic surgery she underwent in her early 20s, driven by an industry that told women their natural faces were not good enough. She talked about the procedures she eventually reversed, including breast implants she had removed in 2015, because she was done allowing Hollywood to decide what she was supposed to look like. When asked about aging, she pushed back hard against the term anti-aging, calling it demeaning and saying that getting older is a privilege, not a problem to be fixed or a reality to be hidden from. That shift in Melissa is not a minor thing. It is the entire distance between who she was at 15, terrified and overwhelmed on a television set in front of millions, and who she became after decades of hard-won self-knowledge. She found that peace in a quieter kind of life. She married actor Timothy Busfield in 2013, and the two of them moved to a small home in the Catskills, where they grow vegetables and raise chickens and live without the constant noise of the industry that shaped so much of her early years. She wrote about that return to simplicity in her 2022 memoir, Back to the Prairie, and readers connected with it deeply because it felt honest in the same way that Little House on the Prairie always felt honest. Not polished, not glamorous, but true. She described rebuilding a rundown farmhouse with her own hands, learning to cope with harsh winters and rural isolation, and finding a version of herself in all of that quiet, physical work that she had never been able to locate under studio lights. For Melissa, going back to something simple was not a retreat. It was the bravest decision she had ever made. What makes that choice remarkable is everything surrounding it. Melissa did not step into that quieter life because things had gone smoothly and she wanted to rest. She made that move in the middle of everything that had not gone the way she had hoped. She had buried people she loved. She had ended marriages. She had looked at her own reflection for years without feeling entirely sure she recognized the woman looking back at her. And she chose, deliberately and consciously, to stop chasing whatever the next version of success was supposed to look like and instead turn around and walk toward something real. The Catskills farmhouse was not a vacation. It was a reckoning. It was Melissa deciding, once and for all, that she was finished building a life for an audience and ready to finally build one for herself. And what she found out there, in the cold mornings and the dote under her fingernails and the slow rhythm of a life built by hand, was something she had been looking for since she was 9 years old, standing on a television set pretending to be someone simple. She found out that she actually was that person. Not Laura Ingalls. Not a character. But a woman who genuinely wanted a life rooted in real things, real work, real love, and real quiet. The show had not invented something false in her. It had pointed towards something true that took her the rest of her life to actually reach. Today, Melissa Gilbert carries everything she has lived through with a kind of grace that only comes from having actually lived it. She is a mother, a wife, a writer, and a woman who has finally stopped trying to be what other people decided she should be. The silence she kept about Dean Butler for all those years was never really about protecting a secret. It was about protecting herself while she worked out how to speak about something complicated in a way that was honest and fair to everyone involved. And now that she has spoken, what remains is not a scandal confirmed or a romance finally revealed. What remains is something far more interesting than either of those things. It is the truth. And the truth, as it turns out, is that what Melissa Gilbert and Dean Butler created together was built on something far more solid than romance. It was built on professionalism, on kindness, on trust, and on the quiet courage it takes to show up every single day and give everything you have to something that matters, even when no one watching can see how much it is costing you. That is the real story, and it was worth every year of waiting to finally hear it. If you have been with this channel for a while, you already know that the stories we tell here go deeper than fame and highlight reels. They are about the real lives behind the famous faces, the parts that never made it into the magazines. If this one stayed with you, hit subscribe so you never miss what comes next. There are more stories exactly like this one waiting, and every single one of them is worth your time.